Section 8 of Bushido, The Soul of Japan, by Inatsu Nitobe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The influence of Bushido and Is Bushido still alive? It is not surprising, however, that the virtues and teachings unique in the precepts of knighthood did not remain circumscribed to the military class. This makes us hasten to the consideration of the influence of Bushido on the nation at large. We have brought into view only a few of the more prominent peaks which rise above the range of knightly virtues, in themselves so much more elevated than the general level of our national life. As the sun in its rising first tips the highest peaks with russet hue, and then gradually casts its rays on the valley below, so the ethical system, which first enlightened the military order, drew in course of time followers from amongst the masses. Democracy raises up a natural prince for its leader, and aristocracy infuses a princely spirit among the people. Virtues are no less contagious than vices. Quote, "There needs but one wise man in a company, and all are wise, so rapid is the contagion," end quote, says Emerson. No social class or caste can resist the diffusive power of moral influence. Prate as we may of the triumphant march of Anglo-Saxon liberty, rarely has it received impetus from the masses. Was it not rather the work of the squires and gentlemen? Very truly does M. Taine say, quote, "These three syllables, as used across the Channel, summarize the history of English society." End quote. Democracy may make self-confident retorts to such a statement, and fling back the question, quote, "When Adam delved and Eve span, where then was the gentleman?" End quote. All the more pity that a gentleman was not present in Eden. The first parents missed him sorely and paid a high price for his absence. Had he been there, not only would the garden have been more tastefully dressed, but they would have learned without painful experience that disobedience to Jehovah was disloyalty and dishonor, treason and rebellion. What Japan was she owed to the samurai. They were not only the flower of the nation, but its root as well. All the gracious gifts of heaven flowed through them. Though they kept themselves socially aloof from the populace, they set a moral standard for them and guided them by their example. I admit Bushido had its esoteric and exoteric teachings. These were eudaimonistic, looking after the welfare and happiness of the commonalty, while those were eretaic, emphasizing the practice of virtues for their own sake. In the most chivalrous days of Europe, knights formed numerically but a small fraction of the population. But, as Emerson says, quote, "In English literature half the drama and all the novels, from Sir Philip Sidney to Sir Walter Scott, paint this figure, gentlemen." End quote. Write in place of Sidney and Scott, Chikamatsu and Bakken, and you have in a nutshell the main features of the literary history of Japan. The innumerable avenues of popular amusement and instruction, the theaters, the storytellers' booths, the preacher's dais, the musical recitations, the novels, have taken for their chief theme the stories of the samurai. The peasants round the open fire in their huts never tire of repeating the achievements of Yoshitsune and his faithful retainer Benkei, or of the two brave Soga brothers. The dusky urchins listen with gaping mouths until the last stick burns out and the fire dies in its embers, still leaving their hearts aglow with the tale that is told. The clerks and the shop boys, after their day's work is over and the amado of the store are closed, footnote, outside shutters, end footnote, gather together to relate the story of Nobunaga and Hideyoshi far into the night, until slumber overtakes their weary eyes and transports them from the drudgery of the counter to the exploits of the field. The very babe just beginning to toddle is taught to lisp the adventures of Momotaro, the daring conqueror of Ogreland. Even girls are so imbued with the love of knightly deeds and virtues that, like Desdemona, they would seriously incline to devour with greedy ear the romance of the samurai. The samurai grew to be the beau ideal of the whole race. As among flowers the cherry is queen, so among men the samurai is lord. So sang the populace. Debarred from commercial pursuits, the military class itself did not aid commerce, but there was no channel of human activity, no avenue of thought, which did not receive in some measure an impetus from Bushido. Intellectual and moral Japan was directly or indirectly the work of knighthood. Mr. Mallock, in his exceedingly suggestive book, Aristocracy and Evolution, has eloquently told us that, social evolution, insofar as it is other than biological, may be defined as the unintended result of the intentions of great men. Further, that historical progress is produced by a struggle, not among the community generally, to live, but a struggle amongst a small section of the community to lead, to direct, to employ the majority in the best way. Whatever may be said about the soundness of his argument, these statements are amply verified in the part played by Bushi in the social progress, as far as it went, of our empire. How the spirit of Bushido permeated all social classes is also shown in the development of a certain order of men known as Otoko Date, the natural leaders of democracy. Staunch fellows were they, every inch of them strong with the strength of massive manhood. At once the spokesmen and the guardians of popular rights, they had each a following of hundreds and thousands of souls who proffered in the same fashion that samurai did to daimyo the willing service of, limb and life, of body, chattels, and earthly honor, Backed by a vast multitude of rash and impetuous working men, those born, bosses, formed a formidable check to the rampancy of the two-sworded order. In manifold ways has Bushido filtered down from the social class where it originated, and acted as leaven among the masses, furnishing a moral standard for the whole people. The precepts of knighthood, begun at first as the glory of the elite, became in time an aspiration and inspiration to the nation at large. And though the populace could not attain the moral height of those loftier souls, yet Yamato Damashi, the soul of Japan, ultimately came to express the Volksgeist of the island realm. If religion is no more than, morality touched by emotion, as Matthew Arnold defines it, few ethical systems are better entitled to the rank of religion than Bushido. Moto Uri has put the mute utterance of the nation into words when he sings, Isles of blessed Japan, should your Yamato spirit strangers seek to scan, say, scenting morn's sunlit air, blows the cherry wild and fair. Yes, the sakura, Cerasus pseudo-cerasus, Lindley, has for ages been the favorite of our people and the emblem of our character. Mark particularly the terms of definition which the poet uses, the words, the wild cherry flower scenting the morning sun. The Yamato spirit is not a tame, tender plant, but a wild, in the sense of natural, growth. It is indigenous to the soil. Its accidental qualities it may share with the flowers of other lands, but in its essence it remains the original, spontaneous outgrowth of our clime. But its nativity is not its sole claim to our affection. The refinement and grace of its beauty appeal to our aesthetic sense as no other flower can. We cannot share the admiration of the Europeans for their roses, which lack the simplicity of our flower. Then, too, the thorns that are hidden beneath the sweetness of the rose, the tenacity with which she clings to life, as though loath or afraid to die rather than drop untimely, preferring to rot on her stem, her showy colors and heavy odors, all these are traits so unlike our flower, which carries no dagger or poison under its beauty, which is ever ready to depart life at the call of nature, whose colors are never gorgeous, and whose light fragrance never palls. Beauty of color and of form is limited in its showing. It is a fixed quality of existence, whereas fragrance is volatile, ethereal as the breathing of life. So in all religious ceremonies, frankincense and myrrh play a prominent part. There is something spirituel in redolence. When the delicious perfume of the sakura quickens the morning air, as the sun in its course rises to illumine first the isles of the Far East, few sensations are more serenely exhilarating than to inhale, as it were, the very breath of beauteous day. When the Creator himself is pictured as making new resolutions in his heart upon smelling a sweet savor, Genesis chapter 8, verse 21, is it any wonder that the sweet-smelling season of the cherry blossom should call forth the whole nation from their little habitations? Blame them not, if for a time their limbs forget their toil and moil, and their hearts their pangs and sorrows. Their brief pleasure ended, they return to their daily tasks with new strength and new resolutions. Thus, in ways more than one, is the sakura the flower of the nation. Is then this flower so sweet and evanescent, blown whithersoever the wind listeth, and shedding a puff of perfume, ready to vanish forever, is this flower the type of the Yamato spirit? Is the soul of Japan so frail immortal? Is Bushido still alive? Or has Western civilization, in its march through the land, already wiped out every trace of its ancient discipline? It were a sad thing if a nation's soul could die so fast. That were a poor soul that could succumb so easily to extraneous influences. The aggregate of psychological elements which constitute a national character is as tenacious as the, quote, irreducible elements of species, of the fins of fish, of the beak of the bird, of the tooth of the carnivorous animal, end quote. In his recent book, full of shallow asseverations and brilliant generalizations, M. Le Bon says, footnote, The Psychology of Peoples, page 33, end footnote, quote, The discoveries due to the intelligence are the common patrimony of humanity. Qualities or defects of character constitute the exclusive patrimony of each people. They are the firm rock which the waters must wash day by day for centuries before they can wear away even its external asperities. End quote. These are strong words and would be highly worth pondering over, provided there were qualities and defects of character which constitute the exclusive patrimony of each people. Schematizing theories of this sort had been advanced long before Le Bon began to write his book, and they were exploded long ago by Theodore Waite and Hugh Murray. In studying the various virtues instilled by Bushido, we have drawn upon European sources for comparison and illustrations, and we have seen that no one quality of character was its exclusive patrimony. It is true, the aggregate of moral qualities presents a quite unique aspect. It is this aggregate which Emerson names a, quote, compound result into which every great force enters as an ingredient, end quote. But instead of making it, as Le Bon does, an exclusive patrimony of a race or people, the Concord philosopher calls it, quote, an element which unites the most forcible persons of every country, makes them intelligible and agreeable to each other, and is somewhat so precise that it is at once felt if an individual lack the Masonic sign." End quote. The character which Bushido stamped on our nation, and on the samurai in particular, cannot be said to form, quote, "an irreducible element of species," end quote. But nevertheless, as to the vitality which it retains, there is no doubt. Were Bushido a mere physical force, the momentum it has gained in the last 700 years could not stop so abruptly. Were it transmitted only by heredity, its influence must be immensely widespread. Just think, as M. Chesson, a French economist, has calculated, that supposing there be 3 generations in a century, quote, each of us would have in his veins the blood of at least 20 millions of the people living in the year 1000 A.D., end quote. The merest peasant that grubs the soil, quote, bowed by the weight of centuries, end quote, has in his veins the blood of ages, and is thus a brother to us as much as, quote, to the ox, end quote. An unconscious and irresistible power, Bushido has been moving the nation and individuals. It was an honest confession of the race when Yoshida Shoin, one of the most brilliant pioneers of modern Japan, wrote on the eve of his execution the following stanza, quote, "Full well I knew this course must end in death. It was Yamato spirit urged me on, to dare whate'er betide." End quote. Unformulated, Bushido was and still is the animating spirit, the motor force of our country. Mr. Ransome says that, quote, "There are 3 distinct Japans in existence side by side today. The old, which has not wholly died out, the new, hardly yet born except in spirit, and the transition, passing now through its most critical throes." End quote. While this is very true in most respects, and particularly as regards tangible and concrete institutions, the statement, as applied to fundamental ethical notions, requires some modification, for Bushido, the maker and product of old Japan, is still the guiding principle of the transition, and will prove the formative force of the new era. The great statesmen who steered the ship of our state through the hurricane of the Restoration and the whirlpool of national rejuvenation were men who knew no other moral teaching than the precepts of knighthood. Some writers, footnote, Spear, Missions and Politics in Asia, Lecture 4, page 189 through 190, Dennis, Christian Missions and Social Progress, Volume 1, page 32, Volume 2, page 70, etc., end footnote, have lately tried to prove that the Christian missionaries contributed an appreciable quota to the making of New Japan. I would fain render honor to whom honor is due, but this honor can hardly be accorded to the good missionaries. More fitting it will be to their profession to stick to the scriptural injunction of preferring one another in honor, than to advance a claim in which they have no proofs to back them. For myself, I believe that Christian missionaries are doing great things for Japan, in the domain of education, and especially of moral education. Only the mysterious, though not the less certain workings of the Spirit is still hidden in divine secrecy. Whatever they do is still of indirect effect. No, as yet, Christian missions have effected but little visible in molding the character of New Japan. No, it was Bushido, pure and simple, that urged us on for weal or woe. Open the biographies of the makers of modern Japan, of Sakuma, of Saigo, of Okubo, of Kido, not to mention the reminiscences of living men, such as Ito, Okuma, Itagaki, etc., and you will find that it was under the impetus of samuraihood that they thought and wrought. When Mr. Henry Norman declared, after his study and observation of the Far East, footnote, the Far East, page 375, end footnote, that only the respect in which Japan differed from other Oriental despotisms lay in, quote, the ruling influence among her people of the strictest, loftiest, and the most punctilious codes of honor that man has ever devised, end quote. He touched the mainspring which has made New Japan what she is, and which will make her what she is destined to be. The transformation of Japan is a fact patent to the whole world. In a work of such magnitude, various motives naturally entered, but if one were to name the principal, one would not hesitate to name Bushido. When we opened the whole country to foreign trade, when we introduced the latest improvements in every department of life, when we began to study Western politics and sciences, our guiding motive was not the development of our physical resources and the increase of wealth, much less was it a blind imitation of Western customs. A close observer of Oriental institutions and peoples has written, quote, we are told every day how Europe has influenced Japan, and forget that the change in those islands was entirely self-generated, that Europeans did not teach Japan, but that Japan of herself chose to learn from Europe methods of organization, civil and military, which have so far proved successful. She imported European mechanical science as the Turks years before imported European artillery. That is not exactly influence, continues Mr. Townsend, unless indeed England is influenced by purchasing tea of China. Where is the European apostle, asks our author, or philosopher, or statesman, or agitator, who has remade Japan? End quote. Footnote. Meredith Townsend, Asia and Europe, New York, 1928. End footnote. Mr. Townsend has well perceived that the spring of action which brought about the changes in Japan lay entirely within our own selves, and if he had only probed into our psychology, his keen powers of observation would easily have convinced him that that spring was no other than Bushido. The sense of honor which cannot bear being looked down upon as an inferior power, that was the strongest of motives. Pecuniary or industrial considerations were awakened later in the process of transformation. The influence of Bushido is still so palpable that he who runs may read. A glimpse into Japanese life will make it manifest. Read Hearn, the most eloquent and truthful interpreter of the Japanese mind, and you see the working of that mind to be an example of the working of Bushido. The universal politeness of the people, which is the legacy of knightly ways, is too well known to be repeated anew. The physical endurance, fortitude, and bravery that, quote, the little Jap, end quote, possesses, were sufficiently proved in the China-Japanese War. Footnote. Among other works on the subject, read Eastlake and Yamada on Heroic Japan, and Diossi on the New Far East. End footnote. Quote, is there any nation more loyal and patriotic? End quote, is a question asked by many, and for the proud answer, quote, there is not, end quote, we must thank the precepts of knighthood. On the other hand, it is fair to recognize that for the very faults and defects of our character, Bushido is largely responsible. Our lack of abstruse philosophy, while some of our young men have already gained international reputation in scientific researches, not one has achieved anything in philosophical lines, is traceable to the neglect of metaphysical training under Bushido's regimen of education. Our sense of honor is responsible for our exaggerated sensitiveness and touchiness, and if there is the conceit in us with which some foreigners charge us, that too is a pathological outcome of honor. Have you seen in your tour of Japan many a young man with unkempt hair, dressed in shabbiest garb, carrying in his hand a large cane or a book, stalking about the streets with an air of utter indifference to mundane things? He is the shosei, student, to whom the earth is too small and the heavens are not high enough. He has his own theories of the universe and of life. He dwells in castles of air and feeds on ethereal words of wisdom. In his eyes beams the fire of ambition. His mind is athirst for knowledge. Penury is only a stimulus to drive him onward. Worldly goods are in his sight shackles to his character. He is the repository of loyalty and patriotism. He is the self-imposed guardian of national honor. With all his virtues and his faults, he is the last fragment of Bushido. Deep-rooted and powerful as is still the effect of Bushido, I have said that it is an unconscious and mute influence. The heart of the people responds, without knowing the reason why, to any appeal made to what it has inherited, and hence the same moral idea expressed in a newly translated term and in an old Bushido term has a vastly different degree of efficacy. A backsliding Christian, whom no pastoral persuasion could help from downward tendency, was reverted from his course by an appeal made to his loyalty, the fidelity he once swore to his master. The word loyalty revived all the noble sentiments that were permitted to grow lukewarm. A band of unruly youths engaged in a long-continued students' strike in a college on account of their dissatisfaction with a certain teacher disbanded at two simple questions put by the director. Quote, "Is your professor a blameless character? If so, you ought to respect him and keep him in the school. Is he weak? If so, it is not manly to push a falling man." End quote. The scientific incapacity of the professor, which was the beginning of the trouble, dwindled into insignificance in comparison with the moral issues hinted at. By arousing the sentiments nurtured by Bushido, moral renovation of great magnitude can be accomplished. One cause of the failure of mission work is that most of the missionaries are grossly ignorant of our history. Quote, "What do we care for heathen records?" end quote, some say, and consequently estrange their religion from the habits of thought we and our forefathers have been accustomed to for centuries past. Mocking a nation's history, as though the career of any people, even the lowest African savages, possessing no record, were not a page in the general history of mankind written by the hand of God himself. The very lost races are palimpsest to be deciphered by a seeing eye. To a philosophic and pious mind, the race themselves are marks of divine chirography, clearly traced in black and white, as on their skin. And if this simile holds good, the yellow race forms a precious page, inscribed in hieroglyphics of gold. Ignoring the past career of a people, missionaries claim that Christianity is a new religion, whereas, to my mind, it is an old story, which, if presented in intelligible words, that is to say, if expressed in the vocabulary familiar in the moral development of a people, will find easy lodgment in their hearts, irrespective of race or nationality. Christianity, in its American or English form, with more of Anglo-Saxon freaks and fancies than grace and purity of its founder, is a poor scion to graft on Bushido stock. Should the propagator of the new faith uproot the entire stock, root and branches, and plant the seeds of the gospel on the ravaged soil? Such a heroic process may be possible in Hawaii, where it is alleged the church militant had complete success in amassing spoils of wealth itself and in annihilating the aboriginal race. Such a process is most decidedly impossible in Japan. Nay, it is a process which Jesus himself would never have employed in founding his kingdom on earth. It behooves us to take more to heart the following words of a saintly man, devout Christian and profound scholar, quote, "Men have divided the world into heathen and Christian, without considering how much good may have been hidden in the one, or how much evil may have been mingled with the other. They have compared the best part of themselves with the worst of their neighbors, the ideal of Christianity with the corruption of Greece or the East. They have not aimed at impartiality, but have been contented to accumulate all that could be said in praise of their own, and in dispraise of other forms of religion." End quote. Footnote: Jowett, Sermons on Faith and Doctrine, 2. End footnote. But whatever may be the error committed by individuals, there is little doubt that the fundamental principle of the religion they profess is a power which we must take into account in reckoning the future of Bushido, whose days seem to be already numbered. End of section 8. Section 9 of Bushido, The Soul of Japan, by Inatsu Nitobe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Future of Bushido. But whatever may be the error committed by individuals, there is little doubt that the fundamental principle of the religion they profess is a power which we must take into account in reckoning the future of Bushido, whose days seem to be already numbered. Ominous signs are in the air that betoken its future. Not only signs, but redoubtable forces are at work to threaten it. Few historical comparisons can be more judiciously made than between the chivalry of Europe and the Bushido of Japan, and, if history repeats itself, it certainly will do with the fate of the latter what it did with that of the former. The particular and local causes for the decay of chivalry which St. Palais gives have, of course, little application to Japanese conditions, but the larger and more general causes that help to undermine knighthood and chivalry in and after the Middle Ages are as surely working for the decline of Bushido. One remarkable difference between the experience of Europe and of Japan is, that, whereas in Europe, when chivalry was weaned from feudalism and was adopted by the Church, it obtained a fresh lease of life, in Japan no religion was large enough to nourish it. Hence, when the mother institution, feudalism, was gone, Bushido, left an orphan, had to shift for itself. The present elaborate military organization might take it under its patronage, but we know that modern warfare can afford little room for its continuous growth. Shintoism, which fostered it in its infancy, is itself superannuated. The hoary sages of ancient China are being supplanted by the intellectual parvenu of the type of Bentham and Mill. Moral theories of a comfortable kind, flattering to the chauvinistic tendencies of the time, and therefore thought well adapted to the need of this day, have been invented and propounded, but as yet we hear only their shrill voices echoing through the columns of yellow journalism. Principalities and powers are arrayed against the precepts of knighthood. Already, as Veblen says, quote, "the decay of the ceremonial code, or, as it is otherwise called, the vulgarization of life, among the industrial classes proper, has become one of the chief enormities of latter-day civilization in the eyes of all persons of delicate sensibilities." End quote. The irresistible tide of triumphant democracy, which can tolerate no form or shape of trust, and Bushido was a trust organized by those who monopolized reserve capital of intellect and culture, fixing the grades and value of moral qualities, is alone powerful enough to engulf the remnant of Bushido. The present societary forces are antagonistic to petty class spirit, and chivalry is, as Freeman severely criticizes, a class spirit. Modern society, if it pretends to any unity, cannot admit, quote, purely personal obligations devised in the interests of an exclusive class, end quote. Footnote: Norman Conquest, Volume 5, page 482, end footnote. Add to this the progress of popular instruction, of industrial arts and habits, of wealth and city life, then we can easily see that neither the keenest cuts of samurai's sword nor the sharpest shafts shot from Bushido's boldest bows can aught avail. The state built upon the rock of honor and fortified by the same, shall we call it the Ehrenstadt, or, after the manner of Carlyle, the hierarchy, is fast falling into the hands of quibbling lawyers and gibbering politicians armed with the logic-chopping engines of war. The words which a great thinker used in speaking of Teresa and Antigone may aptly be repeated of the samurai, that, quote, the medium in which their ardent deeds took shape is forever gone, end quote. Alas for knightly virtues! Alas for samurai pride! Morality, ushered into the world with the sound of bugles and drums, is destined to fade away as, quote, the captains and the kings depart, end quote. If history can teach us anything, the state built on martial virtues, be it a city like Sparta or an empire like Rome, can never make on earth a, quote, continuing city, end quote. Universal and natural as is the fighting instinct in man, fruitful as it has proved to be of noble sentiments and manly virtues, it does not comprehend the whole man. Beneath the instinct to fight there lurks a diviner instinct to love. We have seen that Shintoism, Mencius, and Wan Yang Ming have all clearly taught it, but Bushido and all other militant schools of ethics, engrossed doubtless with questions of immediate practical need, too often forgot duly to emphasize this fact. Life has grown larger in these latter times. Callings nobler and broader than a warrior's claim our attention today. With an enlarged view of life, with the growth of democracy, with better knowledge of other peoples and nations, the Confucian idea of benevolence, dare I also add the Buddhist idea of pity, will expand into the Christian conception of love. Men have become more than subjects, having grown to the estate of citizens. Nay, they are more than citizens, being men. Though war clouds hang heavy upon our horizon, we will believe that the wings of the angel of peace can disperse them. The history of the world confirms the prophecy that, quote, the meek shall inherit the earth, end quote. A nation that sells its birthright of peace and backslides from the front rank of industrialism into the file of filibusterism makes a poor bargain indeed. When the conditions of society are so changed that they have become not only adverse but hostile to Bushido, it is time for it to prepare for an honorable burial. It is just as difficult to point out when chivalry dies as to determine the exact time of its inception. Dr. Miller says that chivalry was formally abolished in the year 1559, when Henry II of France was slain in a tournament. With us, the edict formally abolishing feudalism in 1870 was the signal to toll the knell of Bushido. The edict, issued 2 years later, prohibiting the wearing of swords, rang out the old, quote, the unbought grace of life, the cheap defense of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment and heroic enterprise, end quote. It rang in the new age of, quote, sophisters, economists, and calculators, end quote. It has been said that Japan won her late war with China by means of Murata guns and Krupp cannon. It has been said the victory was the work of a modern school system, but these are less than half-truths. Does ever a piano, be it of the choicest workmanship of Erbar or Steinway, burst forth into the rhapsodies of Liszt or the sonatas of Beethoven without a master's hand? Or, if guns win battles, why did not Louis Napoleon beat the Prussians with his mitrailleuse, or the Spaniards with their Mausers, the Filipinos, whose arms were no better than the old-fashioned Remingtons? Needless to repeat what has grown a trite saying, that it is the spirit that quickeneth, without which the best of implements profiteth but little. The most improved guns and cannon do not shoot of their own accord. The most modern educational system does not make a coward a hero. No. What won the battles on the Yalu, in Korea and Manchuria, was the ghosts of our fathers, guiding our hands and beating in our hearts. They are not dead, those ghosts, the spirits of our warlike ancestors. To those who have eyes to see, they are clearly visible. Scratch a Japanese of the most advanced ideas, and he will show a samurai. The great inheritance of honor, of valor, and of all martial virtues is, as Professor Cram very fitly expresses it, quote, but ours on trust, the fief inalienable of the dead and of the generation to come. End quote. And the summons of the present is to guard this heritage, nor to bate one jot of the ancient spirit. The summons of the future will be so to widen its scope as to apply it in all walks and relations of life. It has been predicted, and predictions have been corroborated by the events of the last half-century, that the moral system of feudal Japan, like its castles and its armories, will crumble into dust, and new ethics rise phoenix-like to lead New Japan in her path of progress. Desirable and probable as the fulfillment of such a prophecy is, we must not forget that a phoenix rises only from its own ashes, and that it is not a bird of passage, neither does it fly on pinions borrowed from other birds. Quote, the kingdom of God is within you. End quote. It does not come rolling down the mountains, however lofty. It does not come sailing across the seas, however broad. Quote, God has granted, says the Koran, to every people a prophet in its own tongue. End quote. The seeds of the kingdom, as vouched for and apprehended by the Japanese mind, blossomed in Bushido. Now its days are closing, sad to say, before its full fruition, and we turn in every direction for other sources of sweetness and light, of strength and comfort, but among them there is as yet nothing found to take its place. The profit and loss philosophy of utilitarians and materialists finds favor among logic choppers with half a soul. The only other ethical system which is powerful enough to cope with utilitarianism and materialism is Christianity, in comparison with which Bushido, it must be confessed, is like, quote, a dimly burning wick, end quote, which the Messiah was proclaimed not to quench, but to fan into a flame. Like his Hebrew precursors, the prophets, notably Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and Habakkuk, Bushido laid particular stress on the moral conduct of rulers and public men and of nations, whereas the ethics of Christ, which deal almost solely with individuals and his personal followers, will find more and more practical application as individualism, in its capacity of a moral factor, grows in potency. The domineering, self-assertive, so-called master morality of Nietzsche, itself akin in some respects to Bushido, is, if I am not greatly mistaken, a passing phase or temporary reaction against what he terms, by morbid distortion, the humble, self-denying, slave morality of the Nazarene. Christianity and materialism, including utilitarianism, or will the future reduce them to still more archaic forms of Hebraism and Hellenism, will divide the world between them. Lesser systems of morals will ally themselves on either side for their preservation. On which side will Bushido enlist? Having no set dogma or formula to defend, it can afford to disappear as an entity. Like the cherry blossom, it is willing to die at the first gust of the morning breeze. But a total extinction will never be its lot. Who can say that Stoicism is dead? It is dead as a system, but it is alive as a virtue. Its energy and vitality are still felt through many channels of life. In the philosophy of Western nations, in the jurisprudence of all the civilized world. Nay, wherever man struggles to raise himself above himself, wherever his spirit masters his flesh by his own exertions, there we see the immortal discipline of Zeno at work. Bushido, as an independent code of ethics, may vanish, but its power will not perish from the earth. Its schools of martial prowess or civic honor may be demolished, but its light and its glory will long survive their ruins. Like its symbolic flower, after it is blown to the four winds, it will still bless mankind with the perfume with which it will enrich life. Ages after, when its customaries shall have been buried and its very name forgotten, its odors will come floating in the air as from a far-off unseen hill. Quote, "The wayside gaze beyond." End quote. Then, in the beautiful language of the Quaker poet, quote, "The traveler owns the grateful sense of sweetness near, he knows not whence, and pausing takes with forehead bare the benediction of the air." End quote. End of section 9. End of Bushido, the Soul of Japan, by Inatsu Nitobe.